He got ambushed by a force of 100 men. Luckily for him, that makes it a fair fight. We again start off on a battlefield. This time, it's the Band of the Hawk fighting against the forces of Tudor. We see Casca tearing up the battlefield, except she seems to be slightly off her game when she gets approached by a general of the Tudor army. He tells her that the battlefield is a place sacred to men, and women should not step foot on it, before demeaning her by stating that she must only be in her position because she slept with Griffith. She charges in, but gets knocked to the ground by, what's your name again?
I, Adon, leader of the mighty Blue Whale Ultra Heavy Armored Fierce Assault Annihilation Night Corps.
Yeah, I'm not calling you that. 3 members of the Hawks ride in, trying to help Casca, but they get easily dispatched by Adon. He then begins to attack Casca, pushing her back towards the edge of a cliff. He goes in for a big strike when it gets blocked by the main man himself. He tells Casca to pull it together and hits Adon away. Adon charges back in with his ultimate 140-year-old family secret technique.
Guns and Senpu!
Upon knocking him back, Guts rides over to Casca, asking her what's wrong, saying that he's never seen her like this before. Casca looks dazed and begins to pass out near the side of the cliff, falling backwards off it. Guts grabs her when Adon, somehow, pulls a crossbow out of his pocket, shooting Guts in the side, causing both of them to fall into the river below. A short time later, as it begins to rain, Guts pulls both of them out of the river and notices that Casca has a fever. He sees a small cave off in the distance that they might be able to hole up in. Inside the cave, Guts is patching up his injuries when he notices Casca's fever is getting worse. He decides to take off her clothes as they are soaked, and wonders why she thought she could fight when she has a fever. He notices blood on his hands and thinks she must be wounded somewhere, when he realizes that she is wounded, but it's from her own body.
I guess it's hard, being a woman.
He wrings the water out of her clothes and stays on watch, keeping her warm. About a day later, Casca wakes up and asks Guts what's happened. He explains that they're in a cave down by the river that they fell into, and she starts to get up. He urgently tells her not to, saying that her fever hasn't fully broken yet and she would still be weak. He apologizes for taking off her clothes, but he was worried she would freeze to death otherwise. When he asks her if she's lost her mind, when she just starts throwing a bunch of shit at him. He says he just saved her life. If it wasn't for him, she'd be dead, and if it wasn't for the fact that she's a woman, he would knock her out. He tells her that she's always ready to just fly into a rage, and that's why women shouldn't be allowed on the battlefield. Casca starts crying, saying it's not her fault. She didn't ask to be born a woman. She says she hates this. Out of everyone, he was the only person she didn't want to be rescued by. She again begins to pass out, and Guts runs over to her. He picks up her unconscious body and brings her back into the cave, thinking to himself she must really hate him. A short time later, Casca is awake and asks Guts if he remembers when he joined the Hawks. After his duel with Griffith, she asks him if he remembers the words of Griffith saying that he wanted him and telling him to join them. Guts says he does, and she says that he is the only person Griffith has ever said that about. Casca asks him why it couldn't be her. Why couldn't she be Griffith's sword instead of him? Guts says he understands and realizes it must be Casca's dream to be Griffith's right-hand man. Or I should say, woman. Nearby, we see several of Adon's men out searching for Guts and Casca. Guts tells Casca they can't stay here any longer. In the late afternoon, they suit up and make their way out. As they're walking through the forest, Casca says that she's told him her reason for fighting, and asks him about his. Unsure himself, he doesn't really give an answer. Then, they come across a large ambush set up by Adon. He makes some seedy threats before telling his men to attack. A few charge in, but get promptly dealt with. Guts then tells Casca that he is going to clear a path for her, but after he does, she doesn't leave, saying that she isn't going to let him fight all these men alone. He tells her no offense, but she's not in the best state right now, and would probably only get in the way. Nearby, Adon tells his crossbowmen to focus fire on Casca. As their bolts loose, Guts rushes over, using his body as a shield. She asks him why. Why would he risk his life for her? When he pulls out the bolt that hit him, telling her to go back to her dream, go back to Griffith. In the meantime, he'll think about an answer to her question about why he fights. Casca begins to run off, promising to bring back reinforcements, telling Guts not to die. Guts begins to take his helmet off, as Adon orders his men not to let Casca escape. Guts tells them they better finish their fight with him before they go chasing after women. The fun for him is just about to start. As he dices through a few men, he cops a bolt in his left hand. Adon berates him, saying he won't be able to swing around his massive sword with just one hand. Guts replies, saying it'll just make things a bit more fun for him is all. We cut to Casca, running away through the woods. Still not feeling 100%, she isn't able to outrun the few men who are chasing her, and one of them throw boulders at her feet, tangling her up and knocking her to the ground. They pin her to the ground, and after she tries to fight back, they tell her to just give it up. They begin to assault her, ripping her clothes off. When she fights back, stabbing the man in the eye before breaking out of her entanglement. She briefly runs away, when the men catch up and are about to attack, when bolts suddenly fly into them from the side. We see Griffith with a group of men on the hill above. who run down and see if she's alright. She immediately tells Griffith that Guts stayed back so she could escape, but he's by himself and heavily outnumbered. Judeau orders every available man to go and help him. Cutting back to Guts, we see even though his vision is fading and he has suffered numerous wounds, he's still pushing on, destroying anyone who comes at him. While fighting, he wonders to himself what he's even doing here. What is he doing in this miserable place? Fighting. He's risking his life and he doesn't even know what for. Griffith's words on that night play in his head, talking about his dream and how he finds it detestable to live out your life simply because you were born into it. At this point, Gus becomes resolute in trying to find his dream, as without having his own dream, he will never be seen as an equal by Griffith, and could never truly be his friend. With that out of the way, he begins to completely tear up Adon's men, no longer thinking, just focusing on the fight at hand. Upon seeing the carnage, Adon's men begin to flee in terror. While trying to keep his men in line, Adon gets knocked onto the ground and passes out. Guts continues to cut down dozens of men. We cut to dawn and can see Casca leading everyone back the way she came from. They reach the battlegrounds and we can see at least 100 dead soldiers on the ground in the nearby area. Casca manages to find Guts propped up on a nearby tree, doing his best impression of a corpse. They all surround him, thinking the worst. Casca runs up and starts shaking him. He grabs her, telling her to knock it off. It isn't helping his pain. Nearby, Adon is found and captured, and Judeau declares Guts the 100-man slayer. Elsewhere, we see the forces of Midland assaulting the fortress stronghold known as Doldrey. The fortress is considered to be completely impregnable, and no one has ever successfully captured it before. After their failed attempt at scaling the walls, the gates open and out rides the fearsome heavy cavalry known as the Purple Rhino Knights, who tears a path through Midland's ranks. After the battle, all of Midland's generals are discussing battle plans at a war table. They all agree that if they can somehow breach Doldrey, due to the inner conflict and civil unrest over imperial succession in Tudor, then that would surely mean an end to the war that has been raging for 100 years. The king asks his generals how they would feel about an all-out attack on the fortress, due to Tudor's civil unrest. They say it would be far too risky, as morale is the lowest it's ever been and many of their men are on the brink of desertion. As they're discussing, one of the men says to Griffith that even his band of the Hawk wouldn't be able to handle it. Griffith casually says he could if he were given the orders. This catches the attention of everyone in the room. Griffith doubles down, saying he wouldn't need a large force. Simply the band of the Hawk alone would be able to accomplish it. Everyone in the room is alarmed at Griffith's overconfidence, putting a mere 5,000 men at a defending fortress that holds 30,000. The king asks him if he's being serious. Griffith nods and the king orders for the Hawks to capture Doldrey. Elsewhere, we cut to the fortress of Doldrey. Boscone is being told about the band of the Hawks being on the march, and is shocked that they expect to take the stronghold with a mere 5,000 men. The high-ranking noble of the castle, with his harem of Griffiths, orders Boscone that in the coming battle, he wants to make sure the leader of the Hawks is brought in alive and unharmed. Boscone argues that if Griffith is killed, it will dissolve any momentum Midland has and assures their victory. The noble, Gennon, being the massive simp that he is, tells Boscone that he has his orders. A few days later, in the morning, the band of the Hawks square up outside of Doldrey, with their backs to the river. They're talking about how difficult a full frontal assault will be. When they ask Guts, they can win, can't they? Guts says it's just like any other fortress they've taken, just a bit bigger. As long as they stick with Griffith's plan, they will win. Elsewhere, General Adon is welcomed back into the castle. Something looks familiar about this here soldier. Back on the battlefield, Guts gets ready, and Griffith hypes the boys up, before leading a charge towards the castle. General Boscone is told by one of his men that Griffith is leading 2,000 men in the vanguard. Curious about his tactics of splitting his already small army into two, he calls for his own advance guard to meet them and crush them into the dust. The two forces meet head-on, with the band of the Hawk quite easily managing to break through the line of the Purple Rhinos. We cut back to Boscone, who is calming his men who are freaking out about the Hawks breaking through the front line. He points out that they're just taking advantage of their light cavalry to break through the lines and damage morale. He orders his heavy cavalry to meet them head-on and their archers to start firing at them from the flanks. I feel like this guy has played 1 or 2 Total War games before. Arrows begin to rain down upon the Hawks, and Guts is surprised that the enemy doesn't seem shaken at all by their charge. Overlooking the battlefield, Gennon curses Boscone, worrying that Griffith could be killed in a maneuver like this. Then, all of his tier 3 subs would have been for nothing. Seeing the heavy cavalry begin to charge in, Griffith orders for a full retreat back to the main force. Boscone contemplates the reason behind Griffith's actions, saying surely he would have known the consequences of his charge. Gennon then rides over, asking him why he isn't chasing after the retreating force. Boscone begins to reply when Gennon interrupts him, saying that Griffith is to be captured alive, and any man who does so will be rewarded with whatever they want. He then proceeds to take over command of the battlefield, ordering all mounted troops to pursue the enemy, with the main goal of capturing Griffith. This man's really about ready to risk it all, huh? Boscone is worried about the defense of the castle, but is ignored by Gennon. He then turns to his right-hand man, telling him to ignore the order to capture Griffith, saying that all hawks must be killed by the end of the day, before leading his troops in a charge. Griffith makes his way back to the main forces, where he gives an inspiring speech, basically saying, "Hey, you've got a river behind you. The only way out is through those heavily armed dudes charging right towards you." Tactical genius right here. Griffith leads his men and the two forces meet. The fighting begins in full. Elsewhere, on the battlements of the fortress, two soldiers are casually chatting about trying to get some booze going on, when a small group of the hawks show up and start making their way inside. They're about to call out about the intruders when they're shot by two disguised guards. We then see more men trying to tell Adon about the hawks entering the castle, when a few members of his posse run out and cut the men down. We see Casca take off her helmet and order her troops to close the gates and not let anyone escape. She thinks to herself that Griffith's plan is working perfectly when she hears something behind her. She sees Adon attacking one of her men, grabbing his spear as he passes out. She tells her men not to interfere. This is her fight. She wants a little bit of revenge. Adon gladly accepts. Back on the battlefield, Bosco notices someone is absolutely destroying his men. He rides up to Guts and they clash. He demands to know who he is. After telling him he's the raiding leader of the Hawks, their battle begins. After a few moments of fighting, it appears they're evenly matched, to the amazement of everyone watching. Nearby, Genon sees his queen, and so does Boscone's right-hand man. Boscone manages to knock Guts off of his horse, and Griffith, upon seeing this, tries to make his way over to him, but gets caught up in the battle. Boscone's man is riding in a straight line towards Griffith, aiming to end it here. As he gets close, Geddon comes in and puts a stop to his charge. Back at the fortress, the fight between Casca and Adon is heating up, with Casca managing to push him back so much that he falls down a flight of stairs. He asks her how it's possible that she's this much better than when they previously fought. She says he caught her at a bad time the other day, as she was a bit under the weather. They fight their way down to the ground, when Casca falls victim to one of his family's secret techniques.
It's the captain of the raiders!
The old look over there. He breaks her sword and pins her back against a wall. Adon then makes some more seedy comments, when she takes a deep breath, grabbing the spearhead, rotating around, pulling out his side sword and stabbing Adon through the mouth. Back on the field, Guts is holding his own against Boscone, but is on the defensive, when 4 members of the Hawks ride in trying to assist him. Guts tells them to stop, but it's too late. Boscone cleaves his halberd around himself, killing all of the men who tried to attack him. After this, he charges Guts, who grabs a falling banner. Boscone comes in with a massive swing, looking to end the fight. He barely manages to dodge the banner thrown by Guts as he proceeds to swing down. His swing kicks up dirt all around them, and Boscone thinks he's won. However, to his shock, he hears Guts begin to scream. In one strike, Guts cuts clean through both Boscone and his horse. Morale in the Tudor army begins to falter, when Genon orders them to fight on, saying that they still have the upper hand in numbers. However, the Band of the Hawk all begin to cheer out, and we see Doldrey, littered with banners from the Band of the Hawk. Guts tells them that their general is dead and their fortress is fallen.
So yeah, I'd say you lost.
The Hawks all start crying out in victory, and the morale of the Tudor army completely crumbles, turning into a full-blown rout. Even Genon's guards flee, and Genon gets knocked to the ground. A short time later, after the dust is settled, Griffith marches his horse up to Genon, who is more than happy to see him. Genon tries to get close to him, but Griffith pulls back. Worried, he asks if Griffith resents him. Griffith says that he doesn't bear him any resentment. In fact, saying that by using him, he was able to provide for hundreds of his men, and they didn't have to risk their lives on the battlefield. He tells Genon that the only thing he can do for those soldiers that share his dream is to continue winning for them. That's why he will do whatever is needed, telling Genon that he was merely a stone lying by the path he is traveling, nothing more. In a rage, Genon charges and promptly gets stabbed in the head, his body left there in the dust. Sometime later, the Band of the Hawk returns back to Midland's capital, Wyndham, where they receive a hero's welcome. Some are soaking up the attention, while others are a bit lost in thought. Later that night, a dance is organized to celebrate the end of the 100-year war. Griffith proceeds to get fawned over by a bunch of women. Caucus talks himself up to a bunch of women. Guts, uncomfortable with the attention, tries to run away from a bunch of women. And Rickett is dangerously close to getting arda-arded. As Guts sits down, away from anyone, he sees Casca in the same sort of situation he was in. She walks over to him, asking for a bit of help from the nobles that keep pestering her. They both walk outside together. They briefly chat, and she asks him if she looks silly in this sort of clothing. He says not at all. You look lovely. She says she's surprised to see him here. He doesn't usually show up to this sort of thing. He tells her that he wanted to see it through to the end. He wanted to see how far Griffith could reach. But he's had enough of looking up at Griffith from just inside his dream. He's the only one he doesn't want looking down on him. Inside, the king begins to make a bit of a speech. He announces that this victory is owed in great part to the services from the Band of the Hawk. Because of this, the king grants Griffith and his men the title of White Phoenix Knights, for the first time in Midland's history, raising them all to nobles. After this, the dancing begins. Casca sees Griffith about to take a dance with Princess Charlotte. She begins to look dejected when Guts walks up and they begin to dance. If this is your first time with Berserk, just soak all this happiness in. Just enjoy it. We then cut to a snowy morning, quite some time later, where we see Guts alone, making his way through the city. He reaches the top of a hill and gives the city one last look before continuing on. Farther up his path, at a tree, Pippin, Judo, Ricket, Casca, and Caucus are all there waiting for him, seemingly aware of his plans to leave the Band of the Hawk. Casca asks him why he's planning to leave now, when their labors are finally starting to bear fruit. He says he appreciates all this, but he's made his mind up. As he pushes through, he sees Griffith, who asks him if he's actually leaving. Guts says he is. Ricket tries to understand why Guts would leave now of all times, when Judo tells him that the decision is Guts's alone. Guts begins to walk off, and Casca again tries to stop him, when Griffith begins to draw his sword, telling Guts that he might have forgotten, but he belongs to him. If he wishes to now be free, the rules have not changed. He must fight for his freedom.
Would you settle for a smile and some fond farewell wishes?
Casca tries to mediate a solution, but Pippin pulls her back, with Judo saying there's no going back now. Guts reflects on the words Griffith said that night, that if someone truly believes in their dream, they should put their heart and soul into it, even if it means opposing him. Guts believes he is just doing what he has to do, to be seen as an equal to Griffith and to be his friend. Griffith declares to himself that he won't let Guts leave, no matter what. His plan of attack is to get the first strike in. He will deflect Guts' downward swing, and then strike his shoulder. He's worried that if his attack is even slightly off, he might kill him, but if he can't have Guts, no one can. Snow falls from a nearby branch and Griffith charges in. Guts retaliates, and in a moment it's over. Underestimating how strong Guts had gotten in their time together, as soon as Griffith's sword made contact, it snapped clean off. He falls to his knees. Guts grabs his things, telling Griffith goodbye, before walking off into the distance. I'm sure Griffith won't take this loss too hard now, will he? That night, feeling powerless and depressed upon losing Guts, he makes his way to Princess Charlotte's chambers, where, in a desperate attempt to be in control again, he bangs the king's daughter, which is seen by one of the handmaidens. The next morning, as Griffith leaves, he is apprehended by the palace guards, who accuse him of treason. Meanwhile, the Band of the Hawk are called to an empty field, and are wondering why Griffith would get them to come here with no weapons or armor, when Pippin hears something and yells out, Just then, arrows begin falling from the sky onto the Band of the Hawk. We see that it's Midland's army. We cut to Griffith in a prison cell, being whipped by the king, who is berating him. Griffith then says he understands now, saying how political marriages are the way the world works, but for some reason Princess Charlotte was never mentioned in marriage talks. Griffith then calls him out, saying that he must lust over his own daughter, perhaps waiting for her to come to him. This drives the king into a rage and he begins whipping Griffith again. Back on the field, Casca manages to hold it together and rally everyone into charging towards the enemy at their weakest point, breaking through. Back in the cell, after the king has had his fill, he orders this gross little dude to do his absolute worst to Griffith, but to make sure he stays alive. Sometime later, the torturer tells Griffith that he's impressed. He's never had anyone not make a sound while he's gone to work on them before. He suddenly notices the bayonet around Griffith's neck and grabs at it, when its eyes open, causing him to freak out and drop it down the drain, floating off, far away from Griffith. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. It only takes a second and it really helps me out.